The incredible thing about Conan the Barbarian and its story origin is that Robert E. Howard was only 26 when he came up with the idea after a trip to Texas. Now, he'd been a creative writer of short stories, but it was Conan that became the story that defined him and the character that his legacy is defined by. But 4 years later, he died by suicide after the death of his mother was announced. She died of tuberculosis. So he went into a car and put a shotgun to his head and ended his life. But he had left a note for his agent, instructions as to what to do with his legacy and what to do with the character of Conan. So when we look at Conan now, and we see it through the eyes of really a relatively young man who was frustrated. He was turned down by many publishers. He was published in some magazines at the time when he was alive, but certainly never lived long enough to realise the legacy of Conan today. The television, theatrical and even theatre productions of Conan have really dominated the cinema landscape since the early 1980s. So Conan the Barbarian is perfect fare for cinema and film producers. In fact, Ray Harryhausen in the 1960s tried to option the rights for himself and producing partner Charles Schneer. Now, of course, Harryhausen was famous for making Sinbad adventures. He'd optioned Jules Verne's novels for Mysterious Island. In fact, he tried to get the rights to The Time Machine, but was beaten to it by his pal, George Pell. And Ray Harryhausen's Time Machine would have had tripoded Martians across the landscape. So quite different from what Pell envisaged. So Ray Harryhausen was quite keen to do something that was authentic and kept the original text in mind and would have respected the Conan work. But the kind of problem for him would have been doing something that would have been for an adult audience. So sword and sorcery films and fantasy were for either children's or family audiences. And when you look at the content of Robert E. Howard's books, that's X-certificate material, something that you'd need to be over 18 to watch. So they couldn't reach an agreement. So Ray Harryhausen had to say goodbye to that and continued with Sinbad and Clash of the Titans and other successful formulas. So in the mid-1970s, Oliver Stone decided he'd like to take on the mantle of film producer, writer and director for a Conan the Barbarian feature film. Ed Pressman was his producer at the time, and between them they thought they had the perfect recipe. Oliver Stone had just won an Oscar for the screenplay for Midnight Express, so he was riding high, and lots of people were interested to see what he could do with a Conan the Barbarian screenplay. Ed Pressman described Oliver Stone's screenplay as like Dante's Inferno but on Earth. So it was a really complex story involving many creatures, mutant armies, and in fact when we look at the screenplay we're reminded of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, so something on a vast epic scale, almost Ray Harryhausen meets David Lean. But it wasn't to be. When they costed out the project in the 70s, it came in at $100 million. And to give that a form of perspective, that would have been the cost of 2 Superman the movies. So it wasn't going to be possible. Also, technology meant that he couldn't achieve most of what he intended on screen. So out of desperation and out of frustration, he turned to Ralph Bakshi, the animator, who'd made Lord of the Rings and many other successful fantasy films. And they thought maybe that would be the route for Conan. They went to London. They spoke to a young commercials director who had just finished a science fiction film called Alien, Ridley Scott, and they asked him if he'd be interested in being involved. And Scott enjoyed meeting with Ed Pressman and with Oliver Stone and was kind of engaged by the artwork of Frank Frazetta, which was on all of the novels of Conan when these guys were growing up and being influenced by their pulp reading. But he was prepping for other films including Blade Runner and turned it down. Enter Italian-American film producer Dino De Laurentiis. Now Dino was looking to create franchises for himself. He came to America in the early 1970s and was very successful already in Europe and had won a Best Picture Oscar with Federico Fellini in Italy in the 1950s for La Strada. They looked at James Bond and they looked at other film series like Sherlock Holmes and thought that Conan had this potential. So when Oliver Stone pitched the idea to Dino, they were both of the similar mind. Now Dino in the early 1970s had created Death Wish with Michael Winner, and that unexpectedly went on to have a series of films in the 70s and 80s. King Kong in 1976 was his great experiment. Could he bring back an American classic and create a franchise from it? The film was very successful. It has its fans today. I'm one of them. It's a great film. It has great music and a score, but it isn't a patch many people think on the 1933 original. but it was one of the most successful films in 1976 and catapulted De Laurentiis into the Super League, where he could get massive budgets from studios. This was a Paramount production for King Kong, but he was going to move now across to Universal Pictures and try and get the funding for Conan the Barbarian, which he did. Now, interestingly, he was repeating the steps he'd made just a couple of years earlier. He'd got the rights to Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon and cast an unknown actor, Sam Jones, to play the lead part of Flash. He was in talks with the owners of Pinewood Studios just outside of London to buy the studios and make 3 Flash Gordon films back to back. So the reason the sets were built so sturdily and so magnificently expensively, with a budget 3 times that of Star Wars, it wasn't because Dino was crazy at spending money. It was that he wanted to make 3 films back to back. So he was thinking franchises all the time. So he purchases the rights to Conan the Barbarian, but appoints new director John Milius to take the reins. When John comes on board, of course, he rewrites the entire project and makes it much more of a realistic war film than a fantasy epic. But the interesting thing was, Dino and John Milius were very strong characters who had very similar views. Now, you'd think that this would actually bring them closer together. If anything, it pushed them further apart. So the real glue in the making of Conan the Barbarian was Dino's daughter, Raffaella De Laurentiis, who at the age of 26 came on board and produced the entire film with future husband Buzz Feitchins. Now, Buzz was working with John Milius on other productions before Conan the Barbarian, like Big Wednesday, and so they came as a team. In fact, they were called the A-Team. Now, between Buzz and Raffaella, they kept the peace because Dino wasn't around much. He was a hands-on producer, but he physically wasn't there much, because in this sort of, I won't call it obsession, but this sort of big interest in trying to acquire franchises, he got the franchise for the Amityville horror series, Halloween, Evil Dead, and Stephen King. He managed to get most of the options to make most Stephen King films first for the cinema. So he was very keen to make sure that he was the next person doing the sequel to successful films. So he was always on board for second pictures: Amityville 2, The Possession, Halloween 2, Army of Darkness, and Evil Dead 2 for the Evil Dead trilogy. But also the Hannibal Lecter series. He came on board for Hannibal with Ridley Scott. Conan the Barbarian had its leading man already in place when Dino De Laurentiis took over. It was to be bodybuilder Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had limited acting experience, but was keen to learn. Now, the problem for Dino was that Arnold had a very strong accent, and during their first meeting they had an argument about this, because he complained, why would such a small man need such a big desk? And then Dino retorted, well, what about the accents? To which Schwarzenegger replied, look who's talking, because Dino De Laurentiis had a very strong Italian accent. So both men parted ways on negative terms. It was several months later, and after lots of petitioning, this time by John Milius, the new director, they decided that Arnold Schwarzenegger would be the right person. But the script was revised. The opening narration on the film by American-Japanese actor Mako was originally intended for Arnold Schwarzenegger, and throughout the script the dialogue was pared back as much as possible to give Arnold Schwarzenegger the opportunity to sort of appear as a presence on screen, but have people around him who are good actors. You have James Earl Jones as Thulsa Doom and Max von Sydow as King Osric, who's returning to his role as a king after appearing in Flash Gordon as Ming the Merciless. Ron Cobb created a world which was both fantasy and realistic. Now, he was caught between two places here, because the original production design work for Conan the Barbarian wasn't really created by Robert E. Howard in his narrative. It was created by American artist Frank Frazetta on his very imaginative and wonderful paintings that were on the covers of most of the books when they were released by Lancer Books in the early sort of 40s and 50s. And that artwork has really set the tone for Conan the Barbarian in every version that we've seen, including in the 2 film versions in the 1980s. And people who did pick up the mantle, like Ray Harryhausen, were inspired by the artwork of Frazetta. So everyone returns back to Frazetta as the sort of the core and spirit of what Conan should look like. So the special effects at the time were either achieved through animation in a stop motion form in the way Ray Harryhausen would create them, or you did something with a man in a suit. But for Conan the Barbarian, they tried something very different. They tried complex animatronics. The large snake that was made was full size in many scenes in the film, was created by Nick Alder. And he created something that hadn't been seen before, something that was a working live action puppet that was operated through hydraulics and through a pulley system and air system, and that didn't need to be manipulated through optical effects afterwards. They didn't need to enlarge the snake, they didn't need to slow it down. It is quite limited in its movements on the film, but I still think it works today. But of course, Conan, when it was put together, it was quite a violent film, and even though the film we know today and the film that we all love has lots of violent scenes in it, when it was first put in front of the censors in America, it was rejected 3 times. So in terms of the scenes that were cut so that the film wouldn't get an X rating, it still had what's called a restricted rating in America. But an X rating would have been quite poisonous because many of the distributors didn't distribute X-rated films in their theatres. So that would have been an issue. So scenes that were cut included the beheading of Conan's parents. Although we see this implied in the film, in the final version, in the original cut that was submitted to the American censors, the heads come off and we see their eyes and mouths move around, because these were animatronic heads that were created by the team on Conan the Barbarian. And also in a rather brutal attack on the village, children were also killed. And in the original script and storyboards that were created by Ron Cobb and William Stout, we can see babies that were thrown and tossed around by the dogs as they ran through the village. And even those storyboards are horrific to look at. So Raffaella De Laurentiis went into some detail about Ned Tannen, the head of Universal Picture, and her father Dino De Laurentiis, and their concerns about the picture. Neither men were particular fans of the story. They were quite anxious about the violence, mainly because it was an expensive film. So the larger your budget is, the more you need to get as many people in as possible. They had a big screening in Las Vegas, and they had a big screening in California as well. And they had bikers attend, so they had some quite intimidating people at this sort of first preview. Of course, it was very successful, but Dino and Ned Tannen were kind of scratching their heads, wondering what is it they're seeing in the film that they're not? What is it the audiences are seeing that they're not seeing? And so that had effects for the following sequels and the franchise. The surprising thing about the release of Conan the Barbarian is that it came out in 1982. The studio was worried that it was quite adult, and yet the subject was quite juvenile. It was mostly younger men that read Robert E. Howard's books at that time, and yet the film did very well in a year that there was only a handful of fantasy and science fiction films. So E.T. the Extraterrestrial was at number 1, and at number 9, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So it would be at number 11 for Conan, finishing for the year, which was quite impressive, given that it was a sword and sorcery epic. It didn't have a famous name leading the production. It was very violent, and it was something that they thought most audiences might not connect with. Surprisingly then, they made a different choice in 1984 for the film's sequel to try and attract a greater audience, but it had the opposite effect. So when John Milius started rewriting Oliver Stone's scripts for the first Conan the Barbarian, he had a clear idea of a trilogy of films that would follow, with the third film being King Conan, where we see Conan finally installed on his throne, obviously with a task to complete. But it was a shame that didn't happen. And John had gone off to film Red Dawn, his Russia invasion of America film. But he was not available to Dino to do the sequel. But Dino didn't want him because of the conflicts they'd had on the first picture. Dino had promised him a gold sword if the film was a great success. And when the film was a great success, he said, "Dino, where is my gold sword?" And Dino said, "There's your sword." These were the kind of men and the kind of posturing that was being dealt with for Raffaella De Laurentiis. So she had a real kind of issue with possibly John Milius coming back. So it wasn't to be. And the sequel for Conan the Barbarian continued with a different director and an entirely different story that had nothing to do with the world of Robert E. Howard. There were very few sword and sandal epics or sword and sorcery epics because the box office for those was really quite poor. If we think about musicals in the 70s and 80s, these weren't something that studios were rushing to release, neither were Western dramas. So when Conan the Barbarian came out in 1982, it pretty much had a clean run, except The Sword and the Sorcerer, which was quickly rushed into production and came out around the same time as Conan the Barbarian, hoping to scoop up some extra business. And I think that's part of the reason that film was as successful as it was. It was a micro-budget film by comparison, but still great fun. In 1982, fantasy and science fiction just was not as popular as people might have thought. So there were lots of films that came out that didn't do well. Tron, Blade Runner, these are two films that opened in 1982 that didn't do well at all. The Dark Crystal, The Thing, and Beastmaster. All of these films failed to recoup their budgets on initial release. Some of them are considered classics today. I love Tron, everyone loves Blade Runner. And The Dark Crystal is great fun. There's even been a Netflix revival of that. So I think you can't always measure film successes by how much they make at the box office, but at the time, that was the only measure. So people often wonder what would happen if there was no Conan the Barbarian in the way that John Milius and Dino De Laurentiis envisaged it. Well, think about Game of Thrones. That could never have happened without Conan the Barbarian. If we think that as novels and comics, it was young men who are mostly interested in Conan, that is not the case now. When we look at broad series like Game of Thrones, like House of the Dragon, they must and do appeal to a broader audience, because after all, it's a business and studios can't afford to make something that's niche and expensive. It has to be a broad landscape. It has to be something that attracts a broad audience. And certainly without Conan, we wouldn't have those films today.